Welcome back for our final session of Politics in Action. We have two fantastic speakers for this final session of what's been a fantastic day. We'll be presenting on Singapore and Malaysia, starting with Singapore. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce Professor Kenneth Paul Tan, who's a tenured Professor of Politics, Film and Cultural Studies at Hong Kong Baptist University. He teaches at the Academy of Film and the Department of Government and International Studies. He also conducts interdisciplinary research at the School of Communication, Global Communication and Power Research Cluster and Smart Society Lab. Previously, he was Vice Dean at the National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy during its most rapid and critical years of growth. He has published numerous articles in leading international journals, reflecting an innovative and interdisciplinary research agenda that bridges political science, public management, policy studies, sociology, urban studies, cultural studies, and film and media studies. His most recent books include Asia in the Old and New Cold Wars, Ideologies, Narratives and Lived Experiences, Movies to Save Our World, Imagining Poverty, Inequality and Environmental Destruction in the 21st Century, and Singapore's First Year of COVID-19, Public Health, Immigration and the Neoliberal State and Authoritarian Populism. He was the founding chair of the Asian Film Archives Board of Directors and the chair of the Board of Directors of theatre company The Necessary Stage. So please welcome Professor Kenneth Paul Tan.
Thank you very much, Lydia, for that really lovely introduction. I appreciate that very much. And hello, everyone. These days, the biggest news coming out of Singapore is that in 6 days' time, Singaporeans will get a new Prime Minister. Lawrence Wong is his name, and he has been waiting in the wings for more than 2 years since he was announced as the chosen one. Today, I want to talk about this new Prime Minister, and these are some other things that I will also talk about. So, the new Prime Minister. Singapore has had only 3 Prime Ministers since becoming independent in 1965. Yeah, 3. Lee Kuan Yew was the first until 1990, when he felt sufficiently confident to hand over his position to Goh Chok Tong. This is how transitions happen in Singapore. Goh was Prime Minister until 2004, when he in turn handed the position over to Lee's oldest son, Lee Hsien Loong. And Lee Hsien Loong has now been in office for 20 years. So what you might call a lack of democratic competition, the PAP government, the People's Action Party government, would describe quite favorably as political stability upon which rational and long-term policy making are possible. Now for Goh and for Lee, the leadership succession was deliberate and very carefully orchestrated. But in the case of the current 4G, fourth generation leadership, the process which began to take place in earnest in 2018 seemed to be rather plodding, circuitous, and even unsure. The most common view about this was a pessimistic one, that the 4G leaders, as accomplished as they no doubt were in their professional capacities, simply lacked the experience, caliber, charisma, and stature for the position of PM. Wong was not the first choice. Heng Swee Keat over there, Heng Swee Keat was. But he stepped down as PM designate in 2021, citing age as the primary reason. Subsequently, Wong and his cabinet colleagues Chan Chun Sing and Ong Ye Kung re-entered the race as front-runners, and it was probably Wong's commendable performance as co-chair in the COVID multi-ministry task force that put him ahead of the competition. Also, the public seemed to find Wong more likable than the others. But listening to Singaporeans discuss this at the time, it often felt like Wong was the lesser of evils. Now, Wong has been portrayed as somewhat atypical. He was divorced, and he recently remarried. He has no children. His upbringing was somewhat modest. He did not study in branded elite schools. He plays the guitar and apparently rides a motorcycle. Or maybe once rode a motorcycle, I don't. But he has a large presence on social media, including platforms like TikTok, where he seems game to participate in the latest viral trends. Now, the local mainstream media has taken pains to emphasize these last few points, partly to present Wong as approachable, likable, and empathetic. But mostly, it was to perform the ideological service of demonstrating that meritocracy works in Singapore, and there is enough social mobility for those from a humble baseline to become a prime minister. But in other ways, Wong is actually quite typical. Another ethnic Chinese man with a scholarly demeanor and impressive achievements. He has had a wide-ranging career in public service, and as cabinet minister, he's helmed key ministries like national development, education, finance. And so knowing the civil service as intimately as he does gives him political capital, necessary for dealing with the many challenges that he will no doubt face in these coming years. And one of these challenges will involve managing intra-party dynamics. Will the rivalry for the prime minister position simply cease now that Wong has been appointed? Why would it? If we assume that the more progressive shades of Wong's public persona are authentic, then how will he deal with powerful and strong-willed hardline ministers in his cabinet? Even with the now reduced dominance of the Lee family in Singapore politics, can Wong really be his own man, given that soon-to-be senior minister Lee Hsien Loong, as well as his influential wife Ho Ching, will sort of still be in the picture? Can he really be his own man? Now, a second challenge for Wong comes from the political opposition, particularly the Workers' Party that, despite several setbacks in recent years, has made impressive gains over the last couple of decades. The Workers' Party have won an increasing proportion of the popular vote and parliamentary seats, giving them an opportunity in Parliament and in their own constituencies to dispel the toxic myths about opposition that have been propagated by a hegemonic ruling party. Many Singaporeans can see that the opposition parties have been able to attract individuals with impressive credentials, attract them into the Workers' Party's leadership ranks. Many Singaporeans also think that opposition politicians are more relatable, emotionally intelligent, and compassionate, qualities that the more coldly logical and technocratic PAP politicians often decry as populist. Now, a third challenge comes from alternative voices in civil society, mobilizing around newer causes such as climate justice, sexual politics, a repeal of the death penalty, and support for Palestine. This new politics is driven by the energies of a younger, less fearful, and more globally connected generation of Singaporeans who are equipped with sophisticated repertoires of activism. And they also reflect the changing values that can often be at odds with the PAP government's core political positions. They reflect a more variegated political culture that, if not managed well, could become highly fractious, polarizing, and divisive. But even more challenging than those three things, will be the hugely uncertain economic environment to which Singapore's fortunes are tied. Regional competition, technological disruption, major world conflicts, US-China rivalry, among other things, are going to more profoundly affect the lives and livelihoods of ordinary Singaporeans who have already been grappling with rising costs, emerging forms of poverty, inequality, demographic tensions, and quality of life issues. Now, these are complex and not just technical problems to solve. And Wong will ultimately be judged by his adaptive leadership, not his technocratic skill, and certainly not the politics of personality that he and his supporting media seem rather intent on showcasing as the more distinguishing features of his leadership. So in these complex circumstances, will Wong be sufficiently open-minded, inclusive, and unifying? Or will he stick rigidly to the success formulas of Singapore's past that may be ill-suited for the challenges of the present? Singapore has been consistently ranked among the least corrupt countries in the world. But 2023 was its annus horribilis. The year began with government leaders justifying in Parliament the decision by Singapore's judicial officials and Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, or CPIB, not to prosecute 6 former senior executives of Singapore-based company Keppel Offshore and Marine, but to issue them with stern warnings instead. Now, in the US courts, a unit of this company had earlier pleaded guilty to conspiring to pay $55 million in bribes for contracts in Brazil over several years. And yet, the PAP government agreed with the assessment that there was insufficient evidence to prosecute in Singapore. Now, regardless of the technicalities of the case, Singapore's ability to deal with international corruption was questioned. And the New York Times article even suggested that standards of justice were differently applied to the wealthy and to the working class. Now, for ordinary Singaporeans living and working in one of the wealthiest and costliest cities in the world, elitism and inequality have been a numbingly sore point. At around the same time, a PAP MP, Tin Palin is her name, took a job as Director of Public Affairs and Policy at a Singapore-based technology company. Singaporeans wondered out loud whether this constituted a conflict of interest, since it was assumed she would represent the interests of a private company in her interactions with ministers and fellow legislators. They wondered how something like this could have been approved by the PAP, which in its rules of prudence requires its members to be scrupulously proper. In July, a video emerged on social media in which Tan Chuan Jin, Speaker of the House, and once in the running for Prime Minister, was caught in a hot mic incident, calling Workers' Party MP James Lim a fucking populist, after he had delivered a speech about providing more help to lower income groups. Now, shortly after, Tan resigned his position, not because of the faux pas, but because of an inappropriate romantic relationship with another PAP MP who also resigned. A married man, Tan often projected a religious and moralistic public persona. Singaporeans were critical of him on moral grounds, but also for compromising the impartiality expected of a speaker. Singaporeans also questioned why the Prime Minister had taken so long to act on this, having known about the affair for almost 3 years. And over there, by a most remarkable, shall we say, coincidence, which set off much conspiracy thinking, another video emerged almost immediately after this, showing 2 senior members of the Workers' Party, opposition Workers' Party, holding hands in a restaurant. Now, this led to their resignation. Now, the extramarital affair had been secretly recorded 3 years earlier and was only at this time released. Now, at around the same time, it emerged that 2 senior cabinet ministers, K. Shanmugam and Vivian Balakrishnan, were renting state-owned colonial-era bungalows on the exclusive Ridout Road. The scandal came to be known as Ridout Gate. These outsized prime properties were managed by a government agency overseen by Minister Shanmugam. In response to this accusation of conflict of interest, the government launched an internal inquiry conducted by another cabinet minister. Separately, CPIB carried out investigations, and the two ministers answered questions in Parliament. Now, all of them concluded that there was no criminal or ethical wrongdoing. However, the optics, as you can well imagine, were not good. To regain public confidence, one can, of course, tighten regulations and make them clearer, but much harder to deal with is the image of well-paid ministers opting for extravagant lifestyles, unlike the vastly more frugal and Spartan choices of the founding generation of political leaders, including Lee Kuan Yew. And very much unlike the lives of regular Singaporeans who live in small public housing apartments, struggle to make ends meet in an expensive and stressful city, and who often receive condescension from ministers who take a tough policy line on social welfare. There's more. Very shortly after, there was another scandal. Transport Minister S. Iswaran was arrested, released on bail, and investigated for receiving gifts from a billionaire hotelier who was mainly involved in bringing Formula One Grand Prix to Singapore. The gifts really amounted to something like 300,000 Singapore dollars. The court case is ongoing. But the official narrative is that this whole affair demonstrates not the failure, but the effectiveness of Singapore's anti-corruption system. This is the so-called own self-check, own self principle. Leave the government to be an effective check on itself. But will Singaporeans accept this in the years to come, or will they demand more transparency and democratic checks and balances? And will they be even less accepting of the PAP government's line about paying some of the highest political salaries in order to ensure a clean government? Now, in March this year, the popular and well-respected Workers' Party chief and leader of the opposition, Pritam Singh, was charged with lying to a parliamentary committee in 2021. He has pleaded not guilty, but if he is convicted, it is possible that he would be disqualified from being an MP and from standing in the next election. And that would be a considerable blow for the Workers' Party and for opposition prospects in general. Let me say something about the elections. The next general elections must be held before November 2025. Some people think as early as November this year. Very important elections. We framed in terms of giving Wong a strong mandate as PM to lead the 4G team and to take Singapore into the next phase. The PAP are no doubt well aware of the possibility that they could do worse than in 2020. And here's why. Percentage of popular votes won by the PAP fell significantly from 2001 to 2011. 2015 bucked that trend, but for very, very particular reasons. That was the year Singapore celebrated its 50th anniversary of independence, SG50, and it was also the year of Lee Kuan Yew's death, so a very emotional year. But 2020 brought us back to the downward trend, even though one might have expected to see a flight to safety during uncertainties surrounding the COVID crisis. But instead, we saw voters actually rally even more strongly. Instead of seeing them rally even more strongly around the PAP government, we saw them swing away from the PAP. So if the trend is the real norm, then 2015 is going to be a really, and 2015 is a really exceptional year, then this coming elections are going to be key for the PAP to reassert its legitimacy. And let me maybe end with maybe some comments about the political significance. So it's important to deeply analyze details and the minutiae of political events. And in Singapore, this is especially so because we're small and politically very placid, right? So little things seem to matter a great, in a disproportionate way. And I tend to, however, be more interested in stepping away from them to see how they relate to broader developments. And one such development that I have been interested to think about is the decay of successful systems like Singapore. Singapore's success is often attributed, correctly I think, to its relatively clean, meritocratic and pragmatic governance. But do recent events gesture towards the possibility that it is in fact turning into a scandalous elitist and dogmatically closed system that is ill-suited to the challenges of a complex world? Is the government's diminished ability to solve the increasingly complex problems that make life harder for many Singaporeans and to inspire and motivate them for better things a sign that both the transactional and transformational bases of its historically enormous political legitimacy are steadily eroding? And will the democratic basis of this legitimacy be viewed with increased cynicism as more Singaporeans will become more critically aware of the bullying style and unfair tactics of the ruling party? I think it is possible to imagine that the forces of change will suddenly galvanize or can suddenly galvanize around a trigger, pulling it with a mixture of desperation and hope. And along that arc, we must ask whether Singapore needs a rejuvenated and radically transformed PAP, or, if this is by now so impossible, whether we need a replacement of what is fast becoming a decadent ruling party establishment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tan, for that very interesting update on Singapore. We now have about just under 10 minutes of time for questions. If you have a question, could you please raise your hand and give your name and affiliation if you have one? So we've got one up the back here.
Hi, Prof. Tan. I'm
Hello.
Merhati from the Philippines, but studying my master's here in University of Sydney. 2 questions. Thank you so much for your presentation about Singapore. I'm curious about how is the Singaporean local politics affects international relations, specifically in fostering its peace and development in ASEAN, and how can this clean governance affect or influence the neighboring developing countries?
Yeah. Oh, that's a really good question. A difficult one to answer, but thank you for it. I think a number of ways, right? One is actually through training and education. Right, so one thing that I've been involved with for several years in Singapore is the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, for example. And the expressed mission of that school was to improve the standards of governance in the region in a very direct way, right? So one of the things we had to do was to, of course, raise a lot of endowments so that we could afford to give scholarships to students principally from the ASEAN region, but also China and India and elsewhere. And the idea there was to bring them to the school, get them to think about policy and governance and development issues, not to do propaganda work for Singapore, but to sort of expose them to some of the strengths and the weaknesses, the successes and the failures of the Singapore model. So if they choose to replicate or to adapt some of the things that Singapore has done successfully, they would do that with a critical lens and be able to kind of adapt them to the particular circumstances of their own countries. And the benefit of that experience also was that students from various parts of ASEAN could also exchange ideas and share their own development experiences as well. And something bigger comes out of it than just learning the Singapore way. Of course, part of the reason for doing that was so that Singapore could make friends with people who would go back and eventually become leaders in their own country. And that expectation of having a network of leaders who were, in some sense, together in the cradle of their policy and governance formation, that network of future ASEAN leaders would be a key to raising the standards of governance and indeed the standards of living in the area. So that's one contribution that I feel quite proud to have been a part of.
Hi, Kenneth.
Hi.
So, I think I brought 2 questions. One of them is coming from this final slide. To what extent is the People's Action Party and also the 4G leaders trapped in its past? And I think the political economy work is path dependence. To what extent is there a path dependence going on? Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah.
And how is it possible to break that? Second one is the reverse of that. Because we're seeing increasing populism around the world, and you have written a bit about that as well. But what's more worrying is the confluence of populism with nationalism and the weaponization of religion. And to what extent do you see the worrying signs of that happening in Singapore? I share some context because also like, the current Gaza conflict, and also like a number of PAP ministers themselves, there's a disproportionate number of Christians also in there. That is, in itself is not a problem, but knowing the religious right-wing fundamentalism going on in the US, the worrying part, would that happen in Singapore? Would there be a kind of a religious populism happening in Singapore? So kind of two different questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Two really excellent and pretty central questions, right? If we're going to consider the future of Singapore. The first one about the being somehow shackled to the experience of success of the past and drawing exclusively from the formulas of success of the past in order to solve problems in the present and the future. Yes, I think that's really a problem with Singapore. And I would say that stepping back, that's because Singapore has become utterly technocratic. Now, many of us love the sound of this, right? If only we could be less political and more technocratic, we would get problems solved and we get the answers and so on. But be careful what you wish for. Because technocracy also means that we end up treating all problems as if they were technical ones, and that somehow you could have textbook answers to them, right? Or the past would give us a model for applying the same solutions to problems that might look the same but aren't. That's the problem, actually, right? Because the kind of leadership that we need is not a technical leadership, but the kind of leadership that we now need in the kind of world that we now live in is an adaptive kind of leadership. One that is very sensitive to the importance of transforming values, behaviors, attitudes of people, right? One that is very aware of the importance to innovate and not to repeat and mimic old patterns of policy making. So being able to innovate depends very much on a kind of risk appetite, right, for this. The problem with a technical approach to policy making is that risk is so low that we don't even want to try something else, even though deep inside, it's fairly obvious to us that what we're doing is not going to help with the kind of future that we're facing. That's the second thing. The third thing is, I think it requires a different kind of mindset where you don't clamp down on dissenting voices. You don't exile dissenting voices, but you actually welcome them and encourage them, because it is these dissenting voices that will help us to see the parts of the problem that may not be so obvious when you take a technical approach to problem solving, right? Now, the problem with Singapore is that the leaders have been so sure of themselves, right? And yet so unsure of their political position that they've been basically clamping down on voices that are inconvenient, that are alternative, or voices that sound so sensible that they might erode the political legitimacy at the heart of the Singapore PAP government myth, right? Which is that the PAP holds the monopoly on all good solutions and so on and so forth, right? So we need to somehow evolve into a system that welcomes dissenting voices, that provides safe spaces where we can experiment with new ways to do it, safe space that can resolve conflicts so that we get... And that sort of speaks to your second point too, right? Which is the fissures and the polarizations and the divisions that come with all sorts of things that are going on in the world, including the Israel-Palestinian/Hamas conflict, right? And how Singapore then deals with its internal ramifications in a multi-racial, multi-religious, multicultural society. That again requires an approach that is more than technical, an approach that needs to also be adaptive.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
So thank you. I know we had another question in the room, but we're at time. Can you please join me in welcoming Professor Taylor? Thank you, First Term.